So now let's turn to the second major section of this course. Now this section is all about learning to read Greek. This is what you've been waiting for. The first section was basically the fundamentals. It was learning the alphabet, it was learning all the sounds, it was learning how everything kind of goes together and what kinds of changes you can expect in terms of phonology, the sounds, and so on. Now this is where we actually start looking at wordings. And I wrote here that you could read sooner by learning units of meaning. Now, here's the thing. Reading vocabulary, as I'm describing it here, is different than just vocabulary. It's vocabulary that you learn in syntactic units. So units that can be one word, but it can be more than one word. It can be a phrase or it can be a clause. So here's a couple tips for you. One thing I would really recommend is that you sort of create your own interlinear text as you go along. So what you need to do is print out the wordings that you're learning, the reading vocabulary, and as you go along, as you work through it, write down what those words mean. Write down what those units mean. Highlight the text, mark it up, make it your own. That's how you really get used to deciphering and reading text. You have to interact with it. The more you interact with it, the better. Now, I want to point out the difference between what we're doing here and what someone does when when a committee makes a Bible translation. The difference is we're starting with glossing the words. Glossing the words means giving it what you could say is the most straightforward equivalent in another language. So we're glossing Greek words and Greek phrases and Greek clauses into English clauses and phrases and words. Now, glossing is not quite the same as translating because translating involves starting with the bigger context and moving down towards the smaller units. And so when you're glossing, you're just trying to give a simple equivalent for each word or each wording that you're working on. When you're translating, you're thinking about what is the outcome of the glossed wording. When I take these Greek words, when I take these Greek clauses, and I put them into English, what is the task I'm trying to accomplish here? Who is the intended audience of this text? Now, when you're just glossing, you're the intended audience. You know what it is in Greek, so whatever you read in English or whatever you write in English, that's just a pointer to you. That just points you to what it was in Greek. When you're translating, you're trying to communicate with somebody who's not looking at the Greek text. So glossing is a little bit different. You can be a little more sloppy, you could say. You don't have to worry so much about how people might misunderstand what you're glossing. All you have to think about is how you are understanding the Greek text. Writing down glosses as you go is a great way for you to work through a bigger section of text piece by piece, and then go back over it and say, okay, now what is the big picture here? What is being said in this larger text? Now, in terms of where to go for more vocabulary resources, I've attached a number of resources to this course, but you can easily look up things like flashcard sets for Greek. You can look up frequency tables that will tell you what are the most frequent words in the Greek New Testament or some other text. There are plenty of vocabulary resources out there. I'll link to some of them. I'll attach some of my own that I've found particularly useful. But if you want to keep learning vocabulary beyond just the section we're going to be reading, then you're going to have to get into some of these. You're going to have to go out and find some resources. And I'll recommend some at the end of the course. So what we're going to cover in this section on reading vocabulary is these 5 things: phrases, clauses, coordination, wrapping, and conjunction. Now that's jargon for you. But as we move through each of these sections, it's going to make more and more sense and it's going to come together for you. And as you start to work through the worksheets and as you start to read the text for yourself, it's really going to come together. Now, the way I've broken these categories down, as I mentioned before, is not the typical way of doing it. Normally, you break up vocabulary into parts of speech. So you'd say verbs, nouns, adjectives, so on and so forth. I've grouped together things that are normally split apart. And you'll see why when I look at the texts. And I think this makes the most sense for learning because there's only a few different categories of words that follow very similar patterns in terms of their actual morphology, which means their form as words. There's actually a very limited number of patterns that words follow if you want to explain about 90% of all of the variation that you see. Now, the last 10% is going to get you into all kinds of detail that we don't need to get into in terms of reading. Because if you ever can't figure out a word, or you're just stuck, or you just don't understand something, you can always look it up. You can always use the different resources that are out there. You can use electronic resources. You can have an interlinear, whatever you need. You can just look back and say, oh, well, I don't necessarily know why, but I know that that's the answer to my question right now. And then you can keep moving. And that's the most important thing, is that you keep moving through text. You keep practicing. You keep working with it. Eventually, you'll start to identify patterns yourself. So I'm going to explain each of these categories as we go through them.